Professor Tootle, good morning.
Good morning.
So, as you know, we're always looking for a laugh or a joke or, some interesting spin on a story or a unique analogy. And for some reason, I'm not in that mood at all today. I kind of think, although we debated, discussed really controversial issues in our 30 or 40 or 50 shows, wherever we're up to now. Abortion and LGBTQ rights and guns and things that are very personal to people. But for some reason, this is the most real to me, this show, because of what's going over in Ukraine and the Soviet invasion. I'm still semi-optimistic, which I realize is probably naive or dumb, maybe even to be optimistic in this area. But I also have this sense of realism that this could be really ugly, and there's going to be 200 million Americans that are just like devastated in a week or a month. And I'm not sure we know how to watch something so horrible right in front of our eyes, because of technology and social media. And I'm not pessimistic, but I've got this sense of, ooh, boy, this is really serious. And I don't think people realize how serious this is. And we could be in a world war in a month. We could be using nuclear weapons in a month. I'm not a parade of horrible guy usually. Anyway, I think you might be able to give some sense of history or perspective or context, not to give me peace of mind, but to maybe have us all think through citizenship differently. So that's kind of my overview of why I think this topic is important. Do you have a response to that or your own overview?
Well, I guess I would just affirm that you're right. I think that war is different, and there's nothing else that is the same as war. And I think that too many times we equate things with being war, but only war is war. And as Sherman said, war is cruelty, and you cannot refine it.
And who said that, Professor?
Sherman, in a letter to the fathers of Atlanta before he attacked Atlanta. He said, war is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. You cannot condemn it in harsher terms than I will, but war is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. And he said, and I will, all the people who start, and actually maybe that's a good starting off point, because in that letter, Sherman explained why this war was happening. He said, all the people who started this war deserve all the curses and maledictions that you can pour out. And he said, I know that I had no part in starting it, but he said, we will have peace, and we will have peace in every part of our common country. And maybe that's I hadn't even thought about this until you asked the question, but Sherman's letter, where he walks through how the Civil War started, and how people should feel about it, how they should feel about his army being on the outskirts of a city and about to lay siege to Atlanta. I think it's useful because, and I think the other reason why maybe you're feeling a little bit down about this is because so many parts of life now are frivolous and easy and not real. And in many ways, we've been kind of tearing ourselves apart over trying to get people to care about what we consider to be essential. And it's hard to get anybody to value these things without an example of its negative. And now all of a sudden, when Putin launches this attack, it reminds everybody, oh, this is why these things are important. And we've spent a lot of episodes talking about the right versus the left and why I don't use those terms. Well, I think we're discovering now the importance of what I've been trying to tell people, which is the people who hold pluralist political philosophy, the Western pluralist political philosophy, that is the important distinction. The important distinction is who's on Putin's side and who is on the side of pluralism, who is on the side of people who want to live free, independent, and prosperous, peaceful lives, and a dictator who wants to prevent that from happening. So it's certainly clarifying these issues, but what worries us, and I think what might be worrying you, is that we haven't been teaching or thinking through these issues for so long. What will the world do? You know, will the world do the right thing in Ukraine? And then the other thing is having sober conversations about what the right thing to do is. And you need adults who are thoughtful and sensitive and have a sense of history, but also know, have a sense of, I mean, we've talked about on this channel also, like the lack of teaching of military history, you know, and people who work at the military colleges would make the same argument, you know. So in all of these cases, what we're worried about is our own strength, our own institutions. Will they hold? Will our culture hold? Will we do the right thing? And then do we even have the capacity to think through what the right thing to do even is?
Great. I appreciate your overview on that. And we'll get back to maybe an answer or two in just 24 minutes and then open it up to Q&A. But I do want to go to the very beginning. Not the beginning, the Big Bang, or maybe Christ, but the beginning. And that's, of course, the founding of our nation. And there's a kind of a perverse analogy between us unshackling ourselves from the brutal tyrant, the king, and what Putin is saying he's wanting to do. He's trying to keep his colony intact, or his empire, or reinvigorate his empire. But I don't want to necessarily talk about that per se, but you can if you wish, if you think it's more important. But the United States is different, at least historically, and now there's other people who have come on board. It wasn't just unshackling ourselves from the king and saying now we're our own king, a la Washington's farewell address, but we are different. Can you take just a quick minute to explain on what does America stand for? Who are we as Americans? How should we view the world in a historical setting?
The United States of America is an ideological nation state, the joining together of a people, a set of ideas, and a government. And based on the idea that the natural state of a human being is to be free. And the existence of this ideological nation state, us, is a threat to every old form of government that is based on violence and tyranny. As our ideas have spread throughout the world, however, there are a lot of people now, countries that have embraced our values, and thus the existence of these countries poses a threat to dictators and oligarchs in places like Russia, because the people of Russia can see that the people of Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia and Poland and Eastern Europe are all safe, prosperous, free. And then also, I think there's an analogy between Russian oligarchs and Southern slave owners. Here are a bunch of people who are wealthy and do not want to give up the sources of their wealth. But having a national system based on keeping this group of people rich is keeping their own civilizations poor. And what you see is that you're never going to see the kind of rates of economic growth from Russia that you see out of all of its neighbors who are engaged in Western or living Western values. And so there is a kind of a precipice or tipping point where somebody like Putin detects weakness in the West, and at the same time understands that his long-term position is also weak. As far as our earliest traditions of foreign policy, our earliest traditions of foreign policy were set into place by Washington and Hamilton, and they held pretty steady. And it was a foreign policy based on thinking through our ideals and our interests, meaning that if you pose the question of when should the United States act, the United States should act only when the action is in keeping with both our ideals and our interests. So if there's something that's in our interests, but it is not in keeping with our ideals, we don't do it. And if there's something that we're sympathetic to that is in keeping with our ideals, but it is not in our interest, then we don't act.
Boy, that's a interesting conclusion. I'll be curious if you have a current recommendation in another 10 or so, 15 minutes.
So, that pretty much held firm until Woodrow Wilson comes along and argues that we need to act out of his ideals. And then the presence of the Soviet Union and the realities of World War II altered what the calculus would be in terms of our ideals and interests. So even with the rejection of a Wilsonian ideals only, God is telling me what to do kind of foreign policy, the reformulation of American foreign policy changed quite a bit after World War II, and then again because of the presence of nuclear weapons.
So Professor, let me interrupt, and you may be on a theme, so try to remember your theme. But let me interrupt because I've lost you a little bit. We were in the Revolutionary War,
yep,
and all of a sudden now we're in World War II. Are there other major demarcations? I mean, do we have to talk about the Spanish-American War or the War of 1812 or the? I mean,
each one of those examples fits with what I just described. So in the War of 1812, it's clearly in keeping with our ideals and interests to be outraged when our sailors and ships are being seized by the British. Our ideals and interests were clearly involved in America. We were, of course, distracted by the Civil War for a few years, but certainly when even the Mexican-American War started, it was justified by the people who supported the Mexican-American War as in keeping with our ideals and interests. And then,
so it wasn't we just wanted the stuff in the Mexican War, American War, for example.
Well, that was it. It turns out it was. I mean, if you're being honest, the president speaking to his cabinet, they wanted to send out this communique that said, we have no interest in taking San Francisco Bay, and Polk, of course, says you leave San Francisco out of it, meaning that the reason they launched that war was in order to seize San Francisco.
I didn't mean to call you on it, but so the answer is we're not always consistent in our ideals and our.
Well, but that's why Abraham Lincoln issued the so-called spot resolution, which was to call out the argument that American blood was spilled on American soil, as if we had some sort of interest in this region between the Nueces and Rio Grande River that was so vital to our national interest that we had to go to war with Mexico. But not to get too far into the weeds in this, but it was clear from people like Ulysses S. Grant, who fought in the Mexican-American War, that he was very sympathetic to the Mexicans and thought that it wasn't really fair or right what we were doing to Mexico. So anyway, but our later interventions and times when we didn't intervene, I think one of the other moments to think about is why we didn't intervene in Hawaii during their uprising. They asked us to intervene to overthrow a monarchy, and Grover Cleveland said, no, put the monarch back on the throne, which they didn't do. But then our intervention in the Spanish-American War, it was something that clearly McKinley didn't want to do, but it seemed to undermine the idea of American authority in the Western Hemisphere that we would allow such a human rights abuse to take place so close to American shores. And then, like I said, World War I is a sort of special case, but I don't know how much you want me to walk you through each of these things, but
yeah, I don't think it's necessary to go through the 12 major wars and all the other
Yeah,
skirmishes.
but my overall point is this: that pre-Wilson American foreign policy was always weighed by people who were trying to balance this test of ideals and interest and our tradition of unilateralism, which is that America needs to be prepared to act alone because we are different than so many other places in the world, American exceptionalism. And, again, just in the interest of time, the calculus changes because of the presence of dictators being able to project their power, industrial power, dictators with the power of industrial countries able to project their power in such a way that it poses a threat to the world, which is what happened in the cases of Japan and Germany. And then, of course, the presence of ideological nation states like the Soviet Union and that are hostile to the United States, combined with nuclear weapons, changes the calculus during the Cold War.
Okay, so Professor, I'm willing to jump with you up to World War II now, but not actually the war itself. I'd like you to give some perspective on the Marshall Plan. And if I read right, it was like 5% of our GDP that American citizens gave to countries that we were just at war with, and our allies. And I think we gave most to England, then France, then Germany, and less to Switzerland, for example. But we put an enormous amount of effort into fixing bridges and factories and economic development after the war, which is kind of unusual, isn't it? I mean, if you're a nation state based off family power, do you actually want to do that, or do you just want to dominate? To me, I think that's a shining example of what America should be about. Now, maybe as a history professor, you disagree, and I missed that class.
Yes, but that's not always the answer. I mean, we didn't have to give any money to Japan, for instance. The idea is that you do what you need to do in order to make sure that countries have what they need in order to create a stable and viable political culture. And sometimes that's money. Sometimes that money represents something vital for that government that allows them to survive. And so I just don't, I want to caution against the idea that the answer is always money, but the answer is sometimes money.
Yeah, well, but it's also systems. So MacArthur in Japan put in systems, not necessarily money, but yeah, it's a point well taken. So isn't there a direct link, though, between the Marshall Plan and NATO? And so I'm leading us up to Ukraine, but isn't there a direct East-West Cold War mentality that came out of who accepted that money from the Marshall Plan and who didn't?
Yes. I mean, the presence of a Western alliance opposed to the Soviet Union was the reality of what people felt was necessary because of the Soviet threat. But also remember that NATO was not the only one. That NATO was the first one, but in addition to NATO, we also had CETO and the Baghdad Pact that were both signed in the years after the NATO agreement was signed. So the idea was that we needed to encircle the communist world and make sure that they understood that if they moved beyond or they moved aggressively or openly, that an attack on one would be an attack on all.
Well, so we've kind of gotten to the topic now, after 18 minutes, of foreign entanglements. I know, the French helped us win the Revolutionary War. So right off the get-go, there's different countries manipulating, local decisions and how they conduct war through our entire history, and warring families for millennia before that. But where are we in the NATO world? Why are we even talking about Ukraine today? Because that's not part of the World War II establishment, the East-West. How do we get from there to today where we're all concerned about Ukraine? And I'm not sure we're concerned in a meaningful way. We're concerned, but we're not, well, I don't want to say we're not concerned in a meaningful way. Time will tell on that. Give us a bridge of our history of foreign entanglements to today's world.
Well, I guess I would also say that even using the word entanglement is...
Okay, good. Go back to the history of that, because it has a long history.
Yeah, it is true that the United States has always wanted to avoid foreign entanglements and not have any permanent friends or permanent enemies. But there's a difference between foreign policy and a foreign entanglement. You know, in our foreign policy tradition, the tradition of Washington and Hamilton, a foreign entanglement would have been a permanent agreement with somebody with values that were anathema to ours, that would potentially drag us into a conflict in which we had no ideals, or that were actually opposed to our interests. So, you know, the idea of being a permanent ally of England meant that we would get dragged into their next war with France. And we wanted to avoid that. I mean, even in the 1920s, you know, one of the reasons why one of the most misunderstood events in American foreign policy history is probably the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which everybody always uses as this joke.
I don't remember studying that, so make sure you...
Well, the Kellogg-Briand Pact was one of these things that was known as kind of an international kiss, where every country on earth got together and agreed to never have an aggressive war again. And people act like it was a bit of foolishness, but the actual history of the Kellogg-Briand Pact is that the French wanted to try to drag us into a permanent alliance that would force us into a negative military alliance with them, a permanent non-aggression pact with France. And so in order to get out of that, again, in keeping with our traditions of trying to avoid what would be a true foreign entanglement, we instead suggested that an alliance of every country on earth. And one of the maxims of foreign policy is that the more signatories to an agreement, the less binding it becomes. So that's one of the reasons why you want to be cautious about how far you extend your military alliances, because again, every time in a military alliance kind of situation, you have to decide, well, it sounds clear enough, an attack on one is an attack on all in some cases, because if Putin tried to do this against Poland, then you'd say, that is a clear instance. But what about a cyber attack? What about a cyber attack that results in critical infrastructure in the physical world actually being damaged? What about a cyber attack that results in critical infrastructure and deaths, or it results in a meltdown, or results in, hospitals losing power and patients dying? So there are a lot of complicated issues that are in between what Putin is doing now and what might trigger a military alliance to kick in. One of the reasons why this Putin's attack is so clarifying is because it is so bold, because there is no justification for it. And the only justifications that he has offered are just bizarre lies.
Well, so Professor, this isn't my position on Ukraine, but I have seen a friend of mine on Facebook, which is authoritative, of course, especially when he posted on Facebook, that we are really in their backyard. NATO/US, EU is in their backyard, and we Americans don't tolerate that. When you're playing with Canada or Mexico or even Central America, or heck, even South America, we have all sorts of interventions in South America, and we don't think our interests and ideals are together, and we don't like the Soviet Union or Russia messing around with North or South America. We're kind of right in their backyard. This is not my position, but I'm going off your train of thought. They're not a member of NATO. They're not in EU. What are we doing?
Russia is an illegitimate state. It has no legitimate interest. Under Putin's regime, they don't have a claim to legitimacy. So I am the idea that we should be aware that this is somebody else's backyard is absolutely true if we were thinking about the Philippines but what else is, who else has a backyard? Poland has a backyard, and Latvia has a backyard, and Lithuania and Estonia, they have backyards, and they're inviting us into their backyards because they are very worried about, and what our presence in those places is doing is it is allowing their citizens to be left alone by their aggressive neighbor. So there is no, and this is the thing that is sometimes frustrating. It was frustrating it feels like reviving all these old debates over the Cold War, but everybody wants to go straight to moral equivalency arguments. And I always begin by saying there is no moral equivalency between these two actors. Do not apply the same, you cannot apply the same standards to these two countries because one of them is right and one of them is wrong. It's like, and one of them is engaged in an aggressive war against their neighbor without any justification. And
so Professor, we're on the same page. As I said, I was using a friend's logic, and hopefully they'll watch this. So if it was applied to a Poland or a Slovenia, etc., then I think there's a fairly unified. It sure looks like Putin has rallied NATO and the EU and America all together. There would be no question, I think, in today's context. But still, they're not in NATO or the EU. And so what do we do? And we will open up to questions in a couple minutes now. Do you have a recommendation as a historian, or no, that's a different field? Your recommendation is just as good as mine.
Sure. Well, I am not specifically a military historian, so but I have friends who are, and but I've also somebody who's paid pretty close attention to politics and international relations in a professional way for many years. So I'm not unqualified to have thoughts. I do also have fields in Soviet and European intellectual history, which I haven't used much professionally but I did study both in a fairly serious way. So yes, I have thoughts. Again, I think the most important thing for Americans to remember is that we should act when it is in keeping with our ideals and in keeping with our interests. So begin by asking ourselves, is it in keeping with our ideals that Ukraine should be a free and prosperous country? And the answer is clearly yes. Is it in keeping with our interests that Ukraine should be a safe, prosperous, and free country? And the answer is clearly yes. That does not necessarily require that we go to war.
Why not?
Because we would probably need to wait until, because usually the threshold for most Americans for when something is worth sending their own sons and daughters out to die, I mean, that is the standard.
That's my standard.
Yeah, is when something represents a direct physical threat to the lives of Americans. So I think until Russia, unless and until Russia does something that is a direct physical threat to the lives of Americans, I don't think that it would be politically justified or accepted by the American people to send American soldiers to go to war with Russia. Because the other thing, you mentioned the Spanish-American War, and there is another good thing to remember about the Spanish-American War is that when you go to war with another country, you don't go to war with another country in that place that starts the war. Right? We went to war with Spain, which meant that we sank the Spanish fleet in Manila, which meant that we ended up taking over the Philippines, an area that no American had any thoughts or had any cares about, and we had no interest in the Philippines, and that we end up in control of the Philippines because the Germans and the Japanese were trying to take it over. And so we should be careful when we understand if we declare war on Russia, we're not declaring war on Russia in Ukraine, we're declaring war on Russia everywhere that Russia exists. And as I said, war is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. So with that in mind, I think that what we should be doing is, I wish we had a time machine, but I would be rushing as much material to support the Ukrainian army and Navy and Air Force. And I would be finding ways, creative and otherwise, that walk right up to that limit of direct American intervention in order to provide them with whatever it would take to keep their government from collapsing. And then, but I would also be preparing for the possibility that their government may collapse, and we might be supporting an insurgency in Ukraine, which is far more difficult. And I would also be doing everything possible to coordinate the actions and participate in the actions of the neighbors who are perhaps willing to engage in direct military aid. I know that the Turkish drones have been shooting down things. I understand that even Soviet era equipment from East Germany and Poland is making its way into Ukrainian hands. And I think that there might be neighbors who might have volunteer forces who want to join the Ukrainian military. But in each one of these cases, I think it's important to listen to the Ukrainians and do what they say they need, because there is often a tendency to try to give them what we want to give them, rather than to give them what they need. Let them prioritize their own needs. So,
isn't it like Professor? That's mostly attuned to what I'm my thinking is, but I'm probably willing to go a step or two further. But not just declare war on Russia and all of a sudden we're in a nuclear World War III thing. That's a really, I think we should proceed cautiously before we do that. But I do think that the Ukrainians have been pretty powerful in saying they want our help, not just American help. Anybody, please help us. Help us. I watched it on the news last night. I watched it again this morning. All sorts of people, help us. And I'm not actually looking for a trigger like Sean Penn was, if he was still there filming, and all of a sudden he got killed, and all of a sudden now we're mad, we're going to avenge Sean Penn. But I think it's really important Ukrainians first, and then their neighbors, and then NATO allies, and not necessarily a tripwire. But I'm inclined to fight, actually. I mean, personally, I'm not in America. I kind of at the stage of my life where I'm willing to do that again. Now Meredith points out that I'm too old and no one wants me. Okay, that's a different matter.
You are under the age limit, by the way. We both are. We're under the age of 60. We could.
And better, I'm an Army officer. My commission never expires. So yeah, it's a realistic scenario for me. Do you think I'm stretching it too far, and you should urge me to be patient? What should we do as American citizens in this? I know we should meme and we should, post on Facebook a Ukrainian flag. But and all that does matter, but does it really matter? I mean, people are dying right while we're talking. What's your thought on what we should be doing now and what we should not be doing?
Well, I do have friends who have gone to Ukraine to fight.
Do you?
So, yeah, I went to high school, and he's been fighting there since the 20-teens. So he has been actively fighting with Ukrainian forces in the first two incursions. So it is happening. And I would just say that if you are so moved to do so, then by all means, God bless you, and please go do it. And I think that he has been acting honorably and doing fantastic, because I don't want to give away too many details of who he is, but he's been when not engaged in military fighting, he's engaged in humanitarian efforts in Ukraine as well. So by all means, I would never say don't do that. I think it's fine and good and noble. But if you aren't willing to do that, then at least contact your elected representatives and spell out exactly what you would be willing to support. In addition to that, there are things that you can do, including putting pressure on companies. And part of this is, it is working. It's easy to make fun of the memes, but it is causing real pain and isolation for the Russian economy right now, because the pressure being put on Russia from places like Disney and Apple and Ford.
BP and Exxon.
Yes, and those are huge, right? So I would say if there are companies that are still participating in the Russian economy, find those and let them know that you do not support their relationship with Russia.
So let me put the finger on you, and I'll have a negative as the last question, but I'll make it up during Q&A. Including oil, why are we importing oil into the United States still? We should suffer and all have increased gas costs?
Yes. Yes.
You're just an authoritative yes. We need to learn how to sacrifice again, not necessarily suffer, but we should sacrifice again.
Yes.
Cool. That was pretty authoritative. All right, let's open it up to Q&A. Jake and Bart, Erica, Barb, Barb's husband. I promise I'm going to memorize your name at some point. Or Tony, who would like to ask a question? Tony, you're sleeping, or you're laying down at least. Take yourself, Mr. Barb.
Yeah, the name's Rick.
So, I know that, Rick. Gosh, thank you. Okay, Rick, what's your question?
Well, we've talked a lot about our ideals, and I think one of the reasons we've been able to sustain those ideals for going on 3 centuries is the very pragmatic approach of making the efforts to secure our nation. And I think the the Mexican War allowed us to establish our presence in the Pacific. I think our acquisition of Hawaii, Alaska, the Lend-Lease program helped to protect our approaches from the coast by foreign adversaries. The Monroe Doctrine, keeping foreign powers out of North and South America, and the incredible accomplishment of being the only nation ever to have dominance on all oceans and secure the freedom of the seas. Has been
and skies and space, although it's contested, but yes, seas, skies, and space.
Absolutely. So I think the Russia in some ways is also taking a pragmatic approach to protect their form of government in terms of trying to have warm water ports on both sides, trying to prevent foreign adversaries from being too close to their borders. And so it ultimately comes down to separating the military and pragmatic approach around our idealism and form of government versus the dictatorship. And I just want to, I can rationalize why what Putin is doing in Ukraine is vital for his survival and the survival of his country. And I think to Professor Tootle's point, their form of government is not the type of government that our world should have for the long term. And I can draw the line and understand the pragmatism of trying to have security that both we and Russia are imposing, and it ultimately comes down to a battle of our ideals, even if we both use the same means to advance the interest of our governments.
So Rick, it sounds like you're mostly with Professor Tootle on where we've been and where we are and why. Do you have a question or a recommendation for us as citizens, or was it just a comment?
I think this whole issue about, I think it's essential that you understand your adversaries and where they're coming from and why in their mind it's important. And I don't think Putin is being an irrational nutcase. I think what he's doing absolutely makes sense for them. And for us to be able to counter it is to really try to get inside his head and understand why he's doing it. Yes, I agree with Professor Tootle 100% that our idealism, our form of government is what needs to be protected. But when it comes down to the actions that Russia takes and what we take, in many ways, they're very similar and driven by the same need for security. And in terms of where the trigger points are and how you avoid escalation, the only model I would have is really what we started that generated the Cold War for so many years around containment. and trying to avoid a direct intervention between the United States and Russian military actually going toe to toe, but using our proxies and other indirect means of trying to advance our military interests. So
a reaction to that, Professor Tootle?
I guess a couple things. Yes, it's important to try to understand what motivates adversaries or even friends around the world. But at the same time, I reject any attempt to say that we need to recognize their interests as legitimate. Their interests are not legitimate. I can understand that Putin, these are things that Putin wants, and yes, he has articulated that he wants these things to take place. But just like we're not in charge of telling him how to feel about America, he's not in charge of telling us how to feel about Russia. And so I don't have any qualms at all about saying, yes, we need to understand these things, but at the same time, we do not have the same interests that they have, because our interests are in keeping the people of Ukraine safe and prosperous and free. And their interest is in keeping
power.
Keeping themselves in power and enriched, and maintaining control over their kleptocracy.
And so, but Professor, why then, because that was an authoritative statement, then why don't we just declare war on Russia? And I knew so because all of a sudden we're fighting Russia all over the world instead of just trying to protect Ukraine. I think that was your answer, but I mean, if it's so clear that our values are different and our interests are aligned, then it seems like right now we have NATO, the EU, and all sorts of other little countries around the world which have agreed with us. It's neat. And I don't mean even little. I mean, all sorts of countries around the world seem to be with us. Isn't this a good time to make a definitive statement how humans should interact with their government?
No. No, because I would just be repeating what I said before, that Americans will not support sending their own people to fight and die in a war in which Americans have not been killed or threatened.
So maybe that's where my meme thing comes in, because it seems like if you were to read the tea leaves of what people are talking about, it seems like they would be willing to go to war. But your point is, well, yeah, but that's the internet and that's just saying some things. In reality, when they really send their sons and daughters off, we might not be so inclined to be doing this in a world war.
Well, I guess to me, war is, again, get back to our Sherman quote, war is cruelty and you cannot define it. The idea that somehow you can control what happens once you have declared a total war against an enemy is so stark and harsh and violent that you simply are being irresponsible if you're not contemplating those sorts of things. Like, you should contemplate what it would mean if your hometown was attacked by nuclear weapons. and because that is a possibility. And if you're not thinking about that as a possibility, then you're not being responsible. And so the idea that we should be thinking about directly declaring war on Russia means that I would want to make sure that anyone who suggested such a thing might understand that it might mean a 20-year conflict in which millions of innocent people die. And if you're willing to take that risk, I would simply say, I'm not there yet.
Yeah, and neither am I. But
we lost your audio. Let's open it up to someone else. Is that what you're saying? Since we can't hear you, Bart.
Professor, this is a really quick question, and I think, I guess my naivete is going to come out here. Because, you're a military historian too. One of the things I don't understand about what's going on in Ukraine right now is that the Russians, to me, appear to be running a fairly incompetent offensive military operation. They've made themselves extremely vulnerable on the ground in the neighboring country, Belarusia, or however you say it. They've got all sorts of equipment and troops just basically sitting out there. In the Ukraine, they've got supposedly convoys that extend for tens of miles, like 40, 50 miles and stuff. Why isn't somebody coming up with some kind of clandestine force to go in there and do some serious damage to this Russian operation? I mean, they've got 75% of their military capacity committed to this right now, and we could seriously degrade that.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I can't tell you. I mean, I think I even heard a general on TV say this, like a bunch of American A-10s could wipe out 85% of the Russian military capacity right now because of the way it's just out there and exposed and lined up in a row. And it is wildly frustrating that we know that we or other Western NATO allied countries excuse me, could absolutely wipe this out. Can you hear me? I muted myself,
yeah.
But yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So yes, it is wildly frustrating. And I don't have a good answer for you, except that the military capacity of Ukraine is such that to expose their own Air Force, for instance, in an attack on that convoy, there must be something prohibiting it from happening. Yeah. And I just and we don't know what that is, but you're right. If this is something that militarily the United States could solve, and that's why when I say that it might not be direct American military involvement, but if we were to, if Turkey's already sending them drones, if we say to Turkey, give them all your drones and we'll replace them. Poland, give them your entire Air Force and we'll replace it. Those are things that I like I said, that would be walking right up to this, but it is incredibly frustrating to know that a little bit of Western military power could make this Russian attack evaporate. And the answer is, I don't know why that's not happening right now.
Fair enough. Did that answer your question, Bart?
Absolutely. Yep. And you didn't even say that I was naive.
No, you're not naive. It's an excellent point.
Yeah, Ben, you're up.
Okay, one of the things that I've heard in the past couple of days is the attack that has caused a fire near their nuclear plant. And I can't help but think that Putin is escalating things because, as the news has reported, should this plant get damaged in any way, this could be worse than Chernobyl, where Chernobyl, if it actually went full, thank you, would have destroyed or irradiated all of Europe. And now we're talking about the Ukraine, which could do damage to Ukraine, Europe, and Russia. So I can't help but think he's trying to escalate things and trying to force NATO to get involved to keep Europe from getting irradiated and trying to force us into the war. What are your thoughts on that?
No, he has a different, again, this is just a guess, but I believe Putin has a different agenda, which is that, first of all, the other nuclear reactor is much larger than Chernobyl. You are correct, but it is a modern facility. And people who have inspected that facility in the last 10 years would say that this is something that if there were a direct attack and there were a meltdown, and that what you would get is maybe at the worst case scenario is venting steam that the people within 150 miles would get as much radiation as a chest X-ray. So in reality, this is an attack meant to terrorize the West. It is something designed to get the United States and the European community, and especially people in the public, more worried about intervening in Ukraine. But the reality of the actual threat posed to the world by that nuclear facility is much less significant than it is being portrayed.
Interesting. Ben, is that, it sounds like you're going to have to do some more research to see if the professor is correct, but is that good enough for today?
Well,
Yeah,
part of it's a guess. I'm trying to get,
Sure.
So I could be completely off about Putin, but I think I'm pretty solid on the reporting on that nuclear facility.
I have heard that it's a more modern plant than Chernobyl ever was, but at the same time, if it does go into a full meltdown, it's going to cause problems. In the case of Chernobyl, for example, when Chernobyl, it actually didn't go to full meltdown, came very, very close to it. If they hadn't drained the water out of the plant, then it would have. But alarms are going off in Sweden with increased levels of radiation. Sweden's going, oh, what the heck is going on in the world right now? So
cool. Sounds like we've got some research to do on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, cool. Good. Thanks, Ben. Jake, you're up.
Okay, I just want to say a disclaimer right now that I support everything that America is doing in all of the NATO countries for sending supplies to Ukraine. I think that it's great that we're supporting them with, funds and weapons. I am 100% in favor of this. However, I want to play devil's advocate. Why should we care? So the question comes back. So back in 1852, when Lincoln was in the Illinois State House of Representatives, there was an emissary from Hungary that showed up. And for some reason, he went to Illinois and he was asking the Illinois State House for help in Hungary's freedom movement against Austria. And Lincoln and the Illinois House of Representatives replied and said, we'll send you our thoughts and prayers, but it's not really in our national interest to help you. We wish you well, but it's not up to our national survival to have to help you. We kind of find ourselves in the same situation with Ukraine. If Russia were to, re-annex Ukraine, the way that I see it, my life probably wouldn't change that much. Ukrainian independence or being reabsorbed by Russia, it doesn't affect me. And so why is America getting involved so heavily with a non-NATO country?
Well, you're right. I mean, the answer is that you are correct. Just like, when presidents ignore rule of law, when they do it once, it's not a big deal. And then the next guy does it and it's not a big deal. The problem with this is that the slippery slopes do work. They happen. They exist for a reason. Actually, I once heard a really brilliant lecture on the slippery slope and how it is not a fallacy from a guy named Eugene Volokh, who writes under the Volokh conspiracy. But he demonstrated how, you aren't being paranoid when you worry about slippery slopes, because they do happen, and it is effective to try to undermine your enemy's position. So you're absolutely right that you could probably live out the rest of your 30s, let's say, and not have to worry about much if Russia took over Ukraine. But it would embolden him. It would embolden China. It would embolden India. It would. It could lead to the collapse of Western civilization.
Okay.
So, and then you would probably have to start caring, because the existence of Western ideals is what keeps us safe. It is what keeps us prosperous. It is what keeps us free. And the concert of free nations that are engaged in peace and prosperity right now, that's very good for the world. And if the world were to slip back into its natural state, the natural state is strong men imposing their will on the weak. it's very easy for that to happen because that is the way that most of world history has gone. So it is the peace, it is the prosperity that is fragile, not, the idea of people who are strong taking things, that's old, and you don't have to teach it. And, it's not hard to learn. But no, I'll concede all day long, Mr. Peterson. You're absolutely right. It would probably not affect your life one way or the other, but it might lead to the collapse of civilization.
The slippery slope. I love your explanation of that, and also saying we should be aware of it. Professor, my wife said, although she doesn't want me to go to war. Are you still with me?
Yeah, your video froze, but we still have your audio.
Cool. We'll see if it keeps going. My wife said, although she doesn't want me to go re-up, she did say there's war crimes going on right now. The hospitals and civilians are being bombed, and civilians are being killed, and those are war crimes. And the more we get to that, the more it makes me want to go, because I just don't want to have civilian populations wiped out, even with your explanation of what war is. So that's kind of a slippery slope argument that makes me want to continue our engagement, or the opposite of Jake's. At some point, something's going to happen. Either Putin's just going to win, and we all go, damn it. Or something else is going to happen, and and the world just is going to be united against him, and something else is going to happen, a la Lindsey Graham. Do you have I know you have to leave in just a few minutes. Do you have some conclusion for us that we should really be thinking through?
Well, I guess I would just disagree with your something's going to happen, because my assumption is that as long as there is a Ukrainian people willing to call themselves Ukrainian and reject the imposition of power by Russia, this is not over. The capturing of cities, the pointing of rifles, the attempt to manipulate politics, none of these things are permanent as long as there is a will among the Ukrainian people to be free and independent. And look no further than Poland. Poland was held under the Soviet Union for 90 years. And as soon as they relaxed their grip a little, Poland came back. So as long as there is a distinctly Ukrainian identity, this isn't over.
That's an excellent point. Brilliant. Last call. A professor has a conflicting appointment that he needs to get to, and he has a few more minutes left. But last call. Tony, are you up or are you sleeping? That was an unsubtle jab. Oh, good. You're not sleeping. Tony, what do you think about this conversation? Where are you at? You're on mute.
So I appreciate the conversation, because it's certainly been something that's worried me. And I have actually two nephews that one's ROTC and one's a commissioned officer now, and I've thought frequently about what would happen if we deployed our people, to the Ukraine. And so I appreciate the perspectives on it. And I certainly am finding myself going, am I willing to send my nephews to Ukraine to die, for whatever's going on right now? And this helps kind of answer some of those questions. So excellent.
Erica, you get the last word today, whether you want to or not. Of course, there you go. Okay. You do want to. Talk to us, Erica.
I apologize. COVID has my voice, but so I know this is annoying, but I just have to say my 15-year-old who listens to these, so thank you, was very frustrated by the dependence on Russian oil. We just have to stop that pipeline. He wanted that to have more play, because he feels like we should be talking about the new climate report that just came out, because that's going to kill us way faster than war with Russia. And dependence on oil and non-renewable sources of energy in that generation's mind is first and foremost. And their JROTC unit is 100% wrapping up their training right now in their Cyber Patriot, because they feel like they are going to war. They will be called in the next 5 or 10 years to step up and protect us from a cyber standpoint. And I think those two things are so tied together, renewable energy and the fact that this is a unique thing, right? Where there's boots on the ground and bombs being thrown. That's obviously not where war is headed, hopefully. Anyway, that's my last thought is we got to do something about dependence on non-renewable forms of energy, or this is never going to stop.
Interesting response, Professor.
Just for anybody who feels strongly about that is an issue, and I do too. This first step is that we need to begin building nuclear power facilities in the United States and converting our energy to our clean nuclear energy, which would enable us to rid ourselves of this, both of these plagues.
The kids agree with you 100%, 100%.
Erica, including nuclear.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah, because they believe the science. And,
but that's
they
a
were
sea
yelling.
Change. But if that's true, Erica, it's not only the Western European countries that are doing aha moment, maybe we need to do something different. But you're saying at least your sphere of younger generation of Americans feel that same way.
100%. They were so frustrated by any news reports about the nuclear facility being under attack because they said they'll turn it off. No, there's no reason to be afraid of that. It's wag the dog. It's that Dustin Hoffman movie where you go to war with a fake country. We're not afraid of those plants at all.
Fascinating. That was a really interesting surprise to me, Professor. So
think about everyone who's 20 years old has been hearing about climate change for their entire lives.
Yeah.
And wondering with frustration why, again, that we haven't been going for the obvious solution to this thing that they've been told for their entire lives is such an important threat to our planet.
Fascinating. Well,
thanks for letting me vent on his behalf, you guys.
I'm glad you called in. Sorry you have COVID or the results of it.
Dumb. Yeah, it's dumb, but whatever.
Yeah, cool. It's 12:02, and I think, Professor, you need to head off in a moment. Do you have a concluding remark? I'm actually comfortable in doing what we're doing, but I'm not looking for a tripwire or an artificial excuse to go help them in a more powerful way. But I am acutely aware, are they willing to stand up for their own ideals in their own country? And thus far, they are.
Yes.
Now I want to see, are their neighbors, Poland, etc., willing to stand up for the ideals and pursuit of their, and if they are, then I continue to want to stand with NATO and EU to protect both our interests and our principles. That's kind of where I am. That's my concluding remark. What would you advise us to think about when we leave?
I would say agree 100%, and but make sure and begin thinking about the implications of what these decisions will mean over the long term. And never stop returning to our fundamental values and thinking about American foreign policy in terms of our ideals and interests.
Well, just one last plug. What is our number one, if you had to choose them, our number one ideal and value in America? What does America stand for?
Our number one ideal is the idea that there is no number one ideal, that what we represent is a balancing of ideals. The pluralism. So our number one ideal is that there is no single theory that that explains or will solve every human issue. That it is impossible to solve problems because human beings are inherently flawed, and thus we need to keep managing these issues and trying to make them better.
So it's not the Republican or Democratic Party plank. It's not who wins the president next time. It's not who controls state legislators and gerrymandering in elections. It's not that stuff. It is whether we're willing to argue peacefully.
Yes.
Okay. Last call for a question. Seeing none, this meeting's adjourned. Professor, thank you for the conversation. This is really important. Unfortunately, we'll have to deal with it again in another couple of weeks or another month once things change on the ground. But hope to see you all next Friday on a different topic. Professor, thank you for your diligence in understanding America's history.